Welcome, everyone. You are here for the Illinois State Museum's program, Do I Know You? Illinois Women You Should Know. My name is Elizabeth Bazan, and I am the Assistant Curator of Art and History Education here at the State Museum, and I'm here with a couple of colleagues. We are going to be introducing you to some dynamic Illinois women tonight. As we get started tonight, we'd like to note that we will be discussing and viewing recreations of crime scenes, as well as some images which depict violence against people of color. So as we get started, without further ado, I am going to introduce my colleague Jen Edgington, who's going to kick us off tonight in our program.
Well, hello everyone. I am Jen Edgington. I'm Director of Interpretation at the Illinois State Museum. And I'm so excited to be able to be the first person to talk tonight about a woman from Illinois history that you may have not heard of before, Frances Glessner Lee. And so with that, Kate, would you switch the slide? Perfect. So Frances Glessner Lee was born March 25th, 1878 in Chicago, Illinois. Her mother wrote in her journal that Frances was delightful, clever, and precocious. That's how she described her daughter. She was born into the family of, so her parents were John Jacob Glessner and Frances Macbeth Glessner. Her mother was a school teacher when her parents met in Springfield, Ohio, so not Springfield, Illinois. Her father worked as a successful agricultural manufacturing company called Warder Child and Company. And when they decided to expand to Chicago, he took that jump to move up, became a vice president with the company, and took this new job in Chicago when they expanded. By age 40, he was a millionaire and was one of the wealthiest people in Chicago. He then went on to become the chairman of the International Harvester Executive Committee, which was when the top 5 agricultural machinery companies came together, which included Deere and his company as well. They were priced very high. Their wealth was very, very high for that International Harvester, and so was the family. Her father helped fund the establishment of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Her parents encouraged and participated in cultural and intellectual self-improvements. They felt that everyone needed to go to school and continue to better themselves. They also had a summer home for their son. So there was Frances and her brother, which we'll talk about in 1 minute. The son had pollen allergies, so they bought a home in New Hampshire. They actually had it made, called the Rocks. So they had a home in Chicago and a home in New Hampshire. So I want to flip to the next slide. This is the family. So you can see her dad, John Jacob Glessner. The mom is next, Frances Macbeth Glessner. The son, who was George. And then we have Frances Glessner Lee, or Fanny. How about one more slide? Okay, thank you, Kate. So not only did they have this house built in New Hampshire called the Rocks, but they also had a large house built on Chicago's famed Prairie Avenue that is still standing today. So you can see it in this picture from back in the day, but you can actually visit it. It's a site. So as you can tell, all of this is to say that Frances Glessner Lee, or Fanny, as she was called as a child, grew up very privileged and in one of the wealthiest families in Chicago. Fanny and her brother were educated in homes of private tutors, where they came to their house in Chicago. She spent time riding horses or playing out at the Rocks. She took a liking to medicine very early on, especially after undergoing a surgery early to remove tonsils, and which really helped solidify what she wanted to do. And she ended up helping the community doctor around town, following him to calls, helping with minor surgeries and illnesses, and even making some medicines. So that's a little bit about her childhood. You can see here the picture of the home, as well as 2 pictures of Fanny that are actually from the Glessner House website. At 18 years old, she went to Europe for 14 months with her aunt. When she returned, she started to see a 30-year-old lawyer named Blewett Lee. This is kind of a sidebar, but I think it's a really good historical fact. Maybe you'll win Jeopardy. Blewett Lee's lawyer father lost out on huge riches after a man came to him and asked him to draw up papers on a secret recipe for a new beverage. His dad, Lee, took a drink and said that it was terrible, so he was not going to take the offer of being paid in company shares that the man offered, and instead took the $25 he was offering to pay. The man was actually the founder of Coca-Cola. So he lost out on having shares in Coca-Cola for a small amount for drawing up these papers. So Blewett Lee, they got engaged in 1897, and they got married at the Glessner home on February 9th, 1898. So Frances Glessner Lee was creative. She loved walking in nature. She loved being outside and learning, and had a very large library, but she was doing things a lot. This didn't always work with her husband, who preferred to stay in, kind of keep to himself, read. And the new couple also relied heavily on the Glessner family to continue the life that Frances was used to. So they were supplementing income, they were providing money, they also provided some housing later on. So friction started to show in their marriage after the first baby, named John Glessner Lee. They had a second child, a daughter named Frances Lee, which was born in 1903. And her father actually had a townhouse built for her, a block down from his Prairie Avenue mansion, that she shared kind of next to her brother. So George was on one side with his family, she was on the other with her family, and they were a block away from the Glessner parents. And it kind of just got a little much. The Glessners were very supportive of Lee, but they supported him even during the separations. It was shortly after this move-in, Blewett and Frances have a brief separation. They reunite and have a third child, Martha Lee. And then in 1908, Blewett moved out permanently and they divorced. Rumor has it, and I couldn't find any. So after divorce, she actually destroyed all photos of them together. I was not able to find any, so that's probably true, but that's the rumor. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. In the 1920s, Frances was spending most of her time at the Rocks and in Massachusetts. She opened an antique store, but her fortune continues to grow as her childless uncle died and left her his entire fortune, as well as what she has from her family. And I'm telling you this because she gets a very unique hobby later in life that she is able to fund. So an old friend of her brother, George, was named George McGrath. And George McGrath went to Harvard with her brother and came to visit in Chicago, and he ends up being the medical examiner in Massachusetts. In 1921, she had a procedure that required a long stay at the Phillips House, which was a hospital's deluxe private care facility. It just so happens that McGrath is there healing from something as well at the same time. So during their time healing together, McGrath starts telling Lee these stories of all of the cases he's worked on, because he's had quite the career. And Lee is fascinated with all of these. So while there, McGrath and Lee start outlining the first Department of Legal Medicine in the United States. They start thinking about, what does that look like? What can it be? And they wanted to set something up to train investigators, medical examiners, insurance salesmen, etc. So using her own collection of library books and money, she funds one at Harvard. And she also advocated for more trained coroners. So before this time, they actually did not have to be trained in medical professions at all to be a coroner. So she advocated for that increase in knowledge, that increase in training, thanks to her work with McGrath. So, well, I think next slide for me. Thank you. So Lee continues to do her work with the Department of Legal Medicine, as well as other organizations, to do early forensic science. So she becomes close to the new director of the department once McGrath kind of ages out of that role. And his name was Mortritz, excuse me. And when he was away training, he would write to her like a colleague, and they worked really closely in the future. So they're always working together on this Department of Legal Medicine. I want to remind you, she never went to medical school. She just had a really strong interest, a curiosity, and she wanted to learn. In the 1940s, Lee wanted to host the first conference to teach about legal medicine. This would include types of death and what evidence to look for. Lee also had a dream to explore dental forensics, and in particular, how dental records could be used in death investigations. She continued to fight for medical examiners over coroners to be better trained and really on the up and up, make sure that they're above board. In her department, though it's not really hers, work really hard to train investigators. So you see here this picture on the slide of all of the men at the table. If you look at the very far end, there's a woman seated there. That's Frances. Yep, thank you, Kate. So that is Frances, who is at the end of the table. She is not just this mascot or the funder, but she's actually part of it. She trains people. She actually starts looking into the police because her desire to better train them to be better investigators are driving her hobbies. So she is starting to listen to the police scanner at home. She is starting to think about how does she train even more police officers. And in 1943, she is made the New Hampshire State Police Director of Education and is commissioned a captain, which you see in this newspaper clip right next to us. And she's the first woman in US to hold this position. She is 66 years old at the time, a grandma, still at lots of life left in her. So in 1944, Lee asked herself, how do you train people to observe? She wants to keep training people, keep exploring this world of forensics and observations. And she wants to move beyond photos and think outside of the box. So she starts to create dioramas that feature real crime scenes. So Lee creates these dioramas based on the crimes from McGrath, other ones she's heard about while she's been out. And she starts building these fantasy worlds, kind of, but based in reality. She uses red nail polish for blood spatter. She focuses on details to make her crime scenes realistic. There is some trouble. So she's doing this during World War II. So there's shortages, including metal, other material. She's also spending a lot of money. There is no record of exactly how much she spent, but estimates put at today's value anywhere to the upwards of $8,000 per diorama or more. So I'm going to show some of the dioramas. These are not graphic, just to give you the heads up. They are real crime scenes depicted. So we'll go to the next slide. Well, here's her working on her dioramas. So you can see her working hard on her miniatures and then also working in one. And we'll go ahead show the next one. Thank you. So this is one of her dioramas, the mini crime scene, if you will. So by the end of her work in this, she's made around 20 nutshell studies of unexplained deaths. That's what you're seeing is. That's what she called them, and of which 18 or 19 still exist. They currently reside at the Massachusetts Medical Examiner Office. She used these nutshell studies to train cops on what evidence to look for. Since these were done for observation, she hosted forensic conferences and training sessions for various law enforcement and other forensic investigators. What's really amazing is these are still currently being used today to train individuals. Lee hosted these homicide trainings herself with no help from Harvard or anyone else, and she would go out of her way to make women feel welcomed in this training. So Frances Glessner Lee ends up dying at the Rocks on January 27th, 1962 at the age of 83. When she does pass away, so a big tribute to her is published on the front page of the Boston Globe. Unfortunately, Harvard closed the Department of Legal Medicine shortly after her death, about 5 years. But since the time of her death, seminars have still been held in Baltimore at the office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland, and the nutshell studies continue to be part of this training, which is amazing. So I wanted to just finish with showing you this crime scene that we have. And then there's one more slide. And this is just to show the detail that went into these dioramas. So you can see there's everything from little bottles next to the bed, the wallpaper's all done, to the messy kitchen for another crime scene with an accurate clock to the time of death, with a calendar up on the wall, as well as even a croissant, it looks like, or a pastry coming out of the oven. So everything is well thought out of. She made them herself to train these police officers. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Kate, but I hope you enjoyed learning about Frances Glessner Lee as much as I love talking about her. So if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end. Thank you.
All right, my turn. So I was looking into the history of flight in Illinois, just kind of fell down one of those rabbit holes and came across Bessie Coleman. And I thought she was really neat, but she has this really incredible connection to Illinois in the early 1900s. And I just kept reading about her, and she's the most incredible person in the world. So Bessie Coleman was born Elizabeth Coleman in 1892 in Atlanta, Texas. She grew up in Waxahachie, Texas. Her parents were sharecroppers. Her mother was African American and her father was African American and Native American. I could not find a reliable source on to get any more specific than that. There were a lot of different answers, so I just she was African American and part Native American. And she was the 10th born of 12 children. She came from a large family. 9 of these children grew up to adulthood, so she grew up in a large family as well. Like I said, her parents were sharecroppers, and Coleman grew up picking cotton in the fields alongside her family to help make them money. Her mother, she also helped her mother with washing. They would take in laundry on occasion to help make ends meet. When she was young, in 1901, her father left the family and moved to Oklahoma to escape discrimination. I'm not sure what happened to him after that. The rest of the family stayed in Texas with their mother. Coleman went to a one-room schoolhouse. It was 4 miles away, so she did have to walk to school every day, but did enjoy going. Eventually, she did attend what is now Langston University, but she could only afford to go for one semester. She did like going to school, but couldn't afford to continue her education. So eventually, when she turned 23, she moved to Chicago. She was part of the Great Migration, people moving from south to north. And some of her brothers had moved to Chicago as well. They had served in World War I and had seen the world and were deciding that living in Chicago was a better place to live. So she moved to Chicago with her brothers, and she attended the Burnham School of Beauty Culture in 1915 and became a manicurist at a barbershop. And so she'd spend her time in these barbershops listening to returning soldiers tell stories of not just flight, but female pilots in Europe, and how women were just as important to fighting in World War I as the men were. And she took a lot of inspiration from these women, and her brothers would joke about how French women could fly, but she couldn't. And Bessie Coleman did not take no for an answer. She applied to basically every flight school in the United States, but no one would take her because not only was she a woman, she was a woman of color. But like I said, Coleman didn't take a no for an answer, and she kept trying. At this time, Harriet Quimby had become the first woman in the United States to receive her pilot's license, and that just drove Coleman to strive even further because she knew it was within her grasp and she could fly. She knew she could. She just had to figure out how to get all the pieces put together. So she eventually becomes friends with Robert Abbott. And if you're not familiar with him, Robert Abbott is the founder of the Chicago Defender, a still in publication Black newspaper. And he was very influential in Chicago, very influential within his community. And Coleman became friends with him, and he encouraged her to continue her pursuit into becoming a pilot. He and another wealthy person in Chicago, whose name I didn't write down, I apologize, even assisted Coleman with her tuition. So what she did was she learned she couldn't get her pilot's license here in the United States, but the French were offering flight lessons and pilot license to women. So Coleman took French classes, learned French in about a year, and then with Abbott's help, went to Paris to become a pilot. Unfortunately, when she arrived in Paris, the flight school she had originally applied to was closed to women at the time because there had been a major accident in one of their training schools, and so they weren't accepting new people at the moment. So she did eventually go to in 1920, she went to France and attended the Cauldron Brothers School of Aviation. And she received her international pilot's license on June 15th, 1921. And it's great. There is a photo of her pilot's license. So this was the official photo that she took for her license. And Coleman just loved flying. She has a quote, "You have never lived until you've flown. The air is the only place free from prejudice." I mean, Coleman dedicated her life to flying. Her dream was to own her own plane and to open a flight school that would accept anyone. She would say that she wanted to open a flight school because accidents happen, and she wanted someone to be able to take her place in case something happened, because she knew how important this was, how being able to access just the open air, how important that was. So when Coleman returned to the United States after receiving her pilot's license, she did what any enterprising young woman would do and went into show business. She became a barnstormer. She would do all sorts of aviation tricks. She'd do loop-the-loops and barrel rolls. And if she was in a two-seater plane, she'd walk across the wings and she'd parachute out of the plane. And she did all sorts of wild stunts and traveled the United States performing. But she would also make sure that she worked very closely with any African-American communities that she came across. She'd show film of her flights at schools and churches, and would host events where people could come and talk to her. She gave speeches but wouldn't perform anywhere with segregated entrances. She used her power to not only entertain, but to make change. There was a stadium in Texas that required segregated entrances, and she straight up said, "I will not perform until you desegregate the entrance." And she did that everywhere that she performed. She wanted to make sure that everyone had an equal opportunity to experience these things. In 1923, she bought her first plane. It was a Curtiss JN-4 Jenny plane as a biplane. I couldn't find any good photographs of the appropriate time period Jennies, so unfortunately I don't have a good photo of that. She also had her first flight accident in 1923. She was flying around testing out her plane, and the engine stalled, and she fell out of the air. She hit the ground. She only cracked a few ribs and broke a leg. And as I said, nothing would stop her. She said, "You tell the world I'm coming back. The fact that I'm alive proves that flying in the air is no more dangerous than riding in an automobile." I mean, she lived, I'm going to keep saying it, she lived to fly. Here's Coleman with one of her planes. This one was probably one owned by an airfield, but she took to the sky and never wanted to come back down. She was back to performing in 1925. She'd healed her ribs in her leg, got back in the air. Didn't take much time to get back out there. Unfortunately, on April 30th, 1926, Coleman was killed in a air crash. She and her co-pilot, William Wills, were scouting an airfield in Florida. They were seeing what the area looked like where they were about to perform. At about 2,000 feet, the engine stalled. A loose wrench was in the engine compartment and got caught in the engine. And neither Wills nor Coleman were wearing their seat belts, as they hadn't expected to be doing aerial tricks, so they weren't strapped in this way they could get a better view of the ground. The plane flipped and Coleman fell straight out of the plane and hit the ground. She died instantly, so I guess that's better than what it could have been, but the world lost a true hero that day. Wills also died in the crash. He remained in the plane, but died on impact when it hit the ground. 5,000 people attended Coleman's funeral in Florida. I only found one source that stated this, so I really hope it's true, that Ida B. Wells performed the funeral services for Coleman in Florida. And in 1931, the Challenger Pilots Association of Chicago began an annual flyover of Coleman's grave. Her funeral services were held in Florida, but she was brought back to Chicago, and she is buried in Chicago. And this tradition continues to this year. Every year they do a flyover of Coleman's grave in Chicago. She was a great inspiration. As of a 2017 survey, 7% of pilots are women, which is still a very small number, but we can owe a lot to Bessie Coleman for breaking a lot of barriers for these women. And I want to finish with another quote from Bessie Coleman. She said, "You can be somebody. You can fly high just like me." And Bessie Coleman was the greatest pilot who has ever lived. I love her story so much. But now I will turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Kate. So I am going to be speaking about Laura Slobe. She is an artist that I just came across recently. She's included in our current exhibit, Edgewise. And she just has an interesting story. And so I wanted to share that all. share it with you all. So Laura Slobe, who's also known as Laura Gray, was born in 1909 to a Jewish family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but she grew up in Chicago. She was an art prodigy and enrolled in the Art Institute at the age of 16. At the age of 19, she was exhibiting her painting and winning prizes for her avant-garde art. I want to take a pause here and go over the word avant-garde for those of you who may not be familiar with that term or have heard it but aren't entirely sure what that means. It is French meaning advanced guard. The movement of avant-garde art and thought began in the 1850s and is generally credited to Henry de Saint-Simon, an influential thinker and forerunner of socialism. As an art movement, it began with the art of Gustave Courbet, who was influenced by early socialist ideas. Movements that are considered avant-garde include Cubism, Futurism, Surrealism, and others. There are still those who argue that art that is pushing boundaries today is also considered avant-garde. So this is something that continues as well. By the late 1930s, she began producing avant-garde sculptures, and we have two of those in our collection. So next slide. So these are two sculptures from our collection. The first on the left is Baseball Player, circa 1935. It's made of plaster and metal and measures 41 by 16 by 19 inches. You can see here it is the form of a human figure who is squatting in, at the top you see where the head should be a round ball suspended behind a metal grate. And then in the arms, which are resting on the legs, you see the left hand is wearing a catcher's glove and the right hand is holding a human head. On the right, you see another plaster sculpture, also circa 1935, entitled Vanity. There is a person sitting on a bench in front of a table which holds a mirror. You'll notice there are, if you're familiar with Cubist art, this holds, to me, this reminds me of that. You see some disproportionate features here, a very long neck. The torso is almost non-existent, with a long arm and very simple facial features in this as well. So these are two of her sculptural works. She really became known, though she started as a painter, her sculpture became more of her medium, and she became known more as a sculptor who sometimes painted. From the spring of 1939 to September of 1940, Slobe worked for the Works Progress Administration Art Project in Illinois as a sculptor and art instructor. As part of the program, she was loaned out to other states and traveled as far as Ohio. 18 months was the maximum time that you could be employed by the WPA. And so that was what brought her service to her time with the program to the end in September of 1940. But she continued to exhibit her work in Chicago until 1944. During this time, she met and interacted with many other avant-garde artists, including composer George Pearl, whom she married in 1940. So Slobe, Pearl, and many of the other avant-garde artists in Chicago were drawn to Trotskyism. It's a branch of Marxism that was developed by Leon Trotsky. Marxism, of course, originated with Karl Marx, who was a socialist thinker who produced the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Socialism originated as a response to the inequities of the Industrial Revolution. As workers struggled to meet their basic needs, corporate owners became increasingly wealthy. So you had this continuous division and widening of the classes. Socialism is different from communism. Communism is considered sort of the extreme end of socialism. Under communism, there's no private property and a strong central government controls all aspects of the economy, providing basic necessities to its citizens. Under socialism, citizens can own property, but industrial production is communally owned. So the means or mechanisms of the economy are communally owned and managed by a democratically elected government. So Slobe and Pearl joined the Socialist Workers' Party in 1942. And as many did when they joined the party, they took on pseudonyms to protect their identity. So Laura became Laura Gray, and George took on his mother's maiden name of Sanders. At the time when she joined, Laura was assigned to assist with an auto workers dispute in Chicago, and she ended up drawing political cartoons for the Union newspaper. Her excellent work was recognized, and she was encouraged to submit her work to the Militant, which was the Socialist Worker Party newspaper out of New York. So next slide. Her first cartoon was published on March 4th of 1944. And this is a copy of the page, of the front page of the newspaper. You can see the Militant at the top, and the large main headline is "Baruch Plan Devised to Pave Way for a Wall Street Grab of Billions." The Baruch Plan, for those of you, I had to look this up, was a plan that would call for the US to reduce its atomic arsenal slowly and only as international controls were put into place. So you'll see it's a little small, but you can see at the top of the cartoon, it says "Serving the Greedy." On the left, you see sort of a butler figure in a coat and tails holding out a platter that says "The Baruch Plan," that holds all sorts of images of industry, a large ship, an oil dike, holding that out to a man sitting at the table with a napkin tucked in his shirt, fork and knife in each hand, and he is labeled "Big Business." While behind them, outside the window, you see two men gazing in from the outside, and this represents the working man who is looking in at this feast that they will have no part in. So after this was published, she became the staff artist at the Militant, and her work appeared almost every week until her death in 1958. Her cartoons were also published in other socialist publications and eventually were featured in over 20 different countries. Topics include anti-communism, the economy, racism, Jim Crow legislation, the Korean War, labor, and political parties. And I'm going to show you some more of her cartoons. These, you can go to the next slide. These are from a calendar that the Illinois State Museum recently acquired that was produced posthumously in 1959. And it has several examples. Here you can see on the left the calendar page with the 3 months underneath. And then the blow up on the right is a large detail of the cartoon. You can see, again, in most of her drawings and cartoons, the working man is shown very cleanly dressed, but in a plain shirt, plain pants. On the right there, you see he's holding what looks like a glowing atom or some sort of atomic symbol underneath as he's standing over a globe. In the back on the left, you can see some sort of planet or sphere that is on fire and cracked. As a man representing capitalism labeled with a $sign in a coat with tails and a top hat holds a missile, and you can see a mushroom cloud above. This is obviously commentary on the atomic industry and war. Next slide. Here again, we see the common representation of capitalism is as a large, robust man who is clearly well-fed in top hat and again, tails. This one is just labeled US capitalism. He is crying, "Hey, look, I'm flying, as he is being shot out of a cannon, which is labeled 42 billion a year in war spending in the midst of this circus. Next. Here we have the working man represented by a Black man who is being tied down. This reminds me of images of Gulliver's Travels, but he's being tied down by figures who are wearing the Ku Klux Klan cloak and hood, as well as a man at the back who I would imagine represents Jim Crow. He also, you can see, has a $sign on his chest, representing capitalism as well. And he is breaking free of these bonds slowly but surely. Next. And here, this is one of my favorites, and this is on display right now in the galleries at the ISM in Springfield. This shows a very small boy who is dressed in obviously a full man's military uniform jacket, and with a gun slung over his shoulder and a large pack on his back and an oversized helmet. This would have been, I'm guessing this was probably drawn in relationship to the Korean War, but obviously in 1959, this calendar, those who were looking at this calendar would also be thinking about the conflict in Vietnam that started that year, I'm sure. I love the juxtaposition here, the contrast between the light surrounding the child and then just this surrounding darkness as well. It just makes for a very striking image. So these are just a handful of her work as a cartoonist. Slobe and Pearl moved to New York after World War II. And though she always considered herself a sculptor and a painter, cartoons were never, she never considered this to be her true work. This is what she continued to create less and less of her avant-garde art. Her marriage to George ended in 1952. And she worked several jobs to support herself, including painting mannequins and creating windows displays for New York department stores. So creative pursuits, but not what was her first love. And yet she continued to produce these cartoons almost every week for the Militant newspaper. Slobe died in 1958 when a bout of pneumonia quickly turned fatal. She had a very delicate health up until this time. In her 20s, she had contracted tuberculosis, which had weakened her lungs. In 1947, she had a lung removed. And so she was unable to survive the pneumonia several years later. George Pearl composed a quintet of for strings entitled In Memory of Laura Slobe, and the Art Institute to this day still gives out the Laura Slobe Memorial Prize for Sculpture. In 1987, the Socialist Worker Party donated 430 cartoons to the Tamanent Library at the University of New York University, where they're available to researchers. However, I couldn't find, they don't seem to be digitized, or if they were, they're not available to the public on their website, though you can find a listing of all of them. You can also find the Militant has all of its back issues. So if you're looking for her work, you can see it there as well. What I find really fascinating about her is what I have said here is just about all you can find out about her. There's very little written about her, despite her work in Chicago in the early years. As far as what I could understand, she did quite a bit of exhibitions, was well known at the Art Institute, and yet couldn't find anything on her website about her other than those who have won the prize that is in her name. So most of the articles that I found were in either were on sites for the Socialist Worker Party or other socialist Marxist sites as well. So her history and her importance to the party is clearly recognized there, and they are the ones who are carrying on her memory. She is clearly a very talented artist whose work was influenced by the political views that she held. Again, avant-garde movement at this time was connected to the socialist movement. And though she always considered herself a fine artist, she was willing to set aside her first loves of sculpting and painting to apply her talents to the cause that she believed in. So I'm excited to be able to share her story and her career and work with you all. And you can come and see this calendar on display in the Edgewise exhibit as well. And so now at this time, if you have questions for either Jen, myself, or Kate, you can drop them in the chat or use the Q&A feature, and we'd be happy to try to answer them.
It looks like we do have one question about Potawatomi women. Do either of you want to talk about the Women's History Trail?
Yes, so we have a website called In Her Footsteps. It's a women's history trail. The idea is that to kind of map out women's history in Illinois so that you can see what is the history of women in your area. And so we do have one story about, oh, Kate, help me with her name. Blanking.
Watchakee.
Watchakee, thank you. So we do have, I believe that article has gone up, or is it in editing phase right now? But it will be there. She was a Potawatomi woman here in Illinois. So that's going to be a resource for you. And like I said, it may still be in editing, but we're trying to get it up this month. Jen, do you want to handle, like, Marcia is wondering, did you say Frances Glessner Lee practiced medicine without a degree?
So she did not practice medicine. She just participated in training for those who would practice medicine. So she never was leading autopsies or helping medical professionals. She did sit in on plenty of autopsies, especially with McGrath, who was trained formally as well as was a medical examiner. She was more training people though in observations and in kind of the beginning stages of forensic science. So she was not formally trained, but definitely trained in spaces like in autopsy rooms with doctors, not formally trained, not performing medical procedures, but definitely thinking about things in different contexts. Like the fact that she was ready to start a new forensic science on dental identification of remains and not having that medical degree says that she was in rooms understanding processes, but did not go to school for it. I think I read, there's a great book called 18 Tiny Deaths, and it's about her many crime scenes, but it talks more about her training and her relationships with those who were training her. That she said she could have been a nurse, but she's glad that she went the way that she did.
And Kate, there's a question. Did Coleman ever meet or speak of Amelia Earhart?
Not that I've been able to find. I did stumble across another woman who was like best friends with Amelia Earhart, who also lived in Illinois, but not Bessie Coleman, not as far as I can tell. I hope they did. I hope that they were friends, but I don't know, unfortunately.
Say thank you so much to Jen and to Kate for speaking tonight, and we hope you all enjoyed these stories of just 3 Illinois women who hopefully you learned a little bit more about. There are a lot of women who are seemingly unknown, and we continue to enjoy sharing those stories with you all. So we hope that you will have a great night.